Good afternoon or good morning, depending where you're at. My name is Robin Lipkowitz, and I'm here with Julie Poppy, and we thank everyone for being on the webinar call, Expanding on the Science, an hour with Jack P. Shonkoff. Today we have fellows who are alumni from last year's inaugural program, as well as our current early learning fellows joining and participating. We also have our project staff, Allison May and Salon Nguyen, on the line today. We know some of you may be participating only via phone and not the webinar platform, and we appreciate your ability to join and listen in. The archive presentation will be available shortly after the webinar, and an email will be circulated when the archive is posted to NCSL's website. We look forward to seeing the current fellows at the final meeting December 6th and 7th in Washington, D.C. to round out our second program year with the Early Learning Fellows. You'll be seeing emails in the next month regarding meeting logistics. So our goals for the next hour is to try to make this presentation as interactive as possible. Should you have a question, please note that there are two different ways that you can ask a question of our expert. One, via phone when we open up the lines, or two, through the chat box that you can see on your computer screen. So as you can see from the agenda on the screen, we'll be with you for an exciting hour with Dr. Jack P. Shonkoff. We had the good fortune to have him present at the Legislative Summit in Atlanta. We know many of the fellows, current and alum, were not able to attend. So you will see his full bio on the screen, so I won't go into a lengthy introduction. But our first presenter is Jack P. Shonkoff. He's the Julius B. Richmond Professor of Child Health and Development at the Harvard School of Public Health and Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's founding director of Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University and chairs the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child. We will also hear from Early Learning Fellow Representative Suzanne Kraut from Indiana, who will give a few thoughts after Jack's presentation to the group. Representative Kraut is Vice Chair of the House Ways and Means Committee and authored this year's Indiana's Early Childhood Advisory Council legislation. Now, Jack, over to you, and thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Robin. And it's hello, everybody. Great to be here. So I'm going to relatively quickly go through this presentation to kind of put some information out in front of the group, and then we hear from Representative Crouch and look forward to the back and forth discussion on this. So basically, the focus of this presentation is to share with you how we are thinking about using advances in science to drive innovation in policy and practice focused on young children, with an interest in thinking about the foundations of learning, behavior, and health on a lifelong basis. So just kind of start with this notion that a thriving and sustainable society begins more generally in terms of investing in young children, but more specifically as we kind of look at these rapid advances in neurobiology, about how we can protect the developing brain in early childhood, recognizing that the brain is both has tremendous promise as it's developing, but also vulnerability, particularly in the early years. So our focus here is advances in neuroscience, which is the study of the development of the brain, molecular biology, genomics, along with all of the continuing advances in the behavioral and social sciences, from our perspective, could really be mobilized to catalyze more effective policies and practices across multiple sectors, not just education, but health and human services as well, to strengthen the foundations of all of the things that we as a society and you as representatives concerned about, effective learning, lifelong health, economic productivity, and responsible citizenship. So we'll start with the fastest crash course I've ever given in the basic science. So just say a little bit about what we know about how experience actually shapes brain architecture as the brain is developing. The slide you see in front of you is a sketch of brain tissue at birth, 6 years of age and 14 years of age. What you see is that the brain cells are connected to each other by circuits, dendrites, and synapses that form so that at birth there are relatively few connections among brain cells. By 6 years of age, you can see that a lot of connections have been developed. Actually, this is just really an underestimate of what it looks like. The rate of synapse development in the first few years of life is actually 700 new synapses formed every single second, which is how the brain goes from billions and billions of cells to trillions and trillions of circuits. But you can also see that at 14 years of age, that those connections have actually been pruned a bit and thinned out, and it's not because the brain is deteriorating by 14 years of age, but in order to work efficiently, the brain has to prune away what it doesn't need. This is the kind of use it or lose it phenomenon. So all of this is happening by the brain literally reading the environment, reading early experiences, and based on the kinds of experiences and interactions children have, some circuits get strengthened and some get pruned away. This is how the brain works. It builds from bottom up for simple circuits and complex circuits. And all of this is influenced by the interaction between adults and children, what we call that serve and return interaction, where kids do things and parents respond and other adults respond. Adults do things and kids respond. So that's kind of how normal brain development happens. The brain overproduces connections and then it prunes them away as it develops more and more refined skills. Now that's the story of healthy brain development and the foundations of competence. This next slide is the story of what happens when things go wrong. This is the story of toxic stress, which is excessive and prolonged activation of the stress response systems as a result of a constant exposure to disorganization, threat, violence, uncertainty, that triggers the stress response system, which results in increases in heart rate and blood pressure and stress hormones and activation of the inflammatory system, increases in blood sugar. All of these things are good in the acute situation to deal with threat, but if the stress system stays activated, it starts to have a wear and tear effect on the body. And you can see in this slide what the difference is. The circled area, this is a schematic representation of the parts of the brain involved in memory and in higher order thinking. You can see in the normally developed brain, you have this rich array of connections among cells. And you see in the face of toxic stress, literally the neurons are damaged. You have fewer connections. This literally disrupts the development of the brain circuits, and particularly in parts of the brain related to memory, early learning, and then higher order problem solving, as well as response to threats. So this is real. There's a real kind of physical effect of prolonged excessive adversity and stress. So let's talk a little bit about kind of what all of this looks like outside of the brain and in behavior and in health, and the things that obviously policymakers have a great deal of interest in. So this slide illustrates the development of vocabulary in children starting in infancy and up to 3 years of age. And the 3 lines on this graph reflect the red line being children raised in families where both parents are college educated and where the family is economically secure. The middle blue line, children raised in families that have working class parents who have no more than a high school education but reasonably steady kind of lower middle income. And the green line at the bottom are children in families where neither parent, or if it's a single parent only, when neither has graduated high school and the family is largely supported by public assistance. And what we see is that when children normally start developing the ability to say words that have meaning, which is usually around 16 to 18 months, shortly after children begin to develop a vocabulary, we see this increasing gap in the size of the vocabulary, the number of words that children can speak with meaning, that the children in the higher educated families with higher income accelerate and develop an increasing gap between both children in families where there was no college education and particularly children in families where there wasn't even a high school diploma achieved. This is not genetic. It's not something that's inborn. This is a reflection of the differences in the language environment in which children are growing up. Children in more highly educated families are talked to more. They hear more varied language, more varied vocabulary. There's more explanation of things, whereas in families with less income and less education, more kind of less conversation with the children and more kind of directions about do this, do that, rather than explanations. In the presence of intervention, we can collapse these gaps. In the absence of intervention, you can see that the achievement gap is beginning way before children start school. By the time kids get to kindergarten without intervention, the children in more advantaged homes have 3 to 4 times the vocabulary of children in less educated homes, and this is a strong predictor of third-grade reading scores and ultimate high school graduation. This slide shows that this is looking at the more of the toxic stress side, not the enrichment side. What it shows is for children, all of the children in this study were in the child welfare system. As the number of risk factors in a child's life increases, beyond abuse and neglect, problems of limited poverty, limited parent income, parental mental health problems, particularly depression in mothers, substance abuse, exposure to violence. By the time you get the 6 or 7 risk factors, essentially 90 to 100% of the children are failing a developmental test at age 3 years, which in most states makes them eligible for early intervention services, and in all cases means that you're headed toward the need for special education. Again, this is not inborn. This is the result of the buildup of adversity and its effect on developing brain structures. These developmental delays are not just in emotional and social development, they're also in language and cognition. So now we move into the health area. These data are taken from a study done in New Zealand, a town called Dunedin, where all of the pregnant women in a given year were enrolled in a study and followed from the time of their pregnancy, then through the birth of the baby. And these are data following those newborns as they grow up and into adult life. These are data taken at age 32 years of individuals who've been followed since before they were born. In this particular slide, we're looking at results of measuring a substance in the blood called C-reactive protein. This is a marker of inflammation. It's been well documented to be a risk factor for heart disease. Think of it as something like cholesterol. An elevated CRP, C-reactive protein, doesn't mean you have heart disease, but it means you're at greater risk for heart disease. What this study showed is that about 15% of the healthy 32-year-old population had an elevated C-reactive protein. That's a normal variation. It probably has some genetic influence. If you look at those individuals at age 32 who had a diagnosis of depression, a much higher rate of elevated C-reactive protein, up around 25% now, 1 out of 4. And this has been described in the past as a well-known association between elevated C-reactive protein and depression. But if you look at the yellow bar, this is children who had a documented history of having been maltreated as children. And now at age 32 years, almost 1 out of 3 of those adults had elevated C-reactive proteins that was linked to maltreatment as a child. This is one of the first studies. There have been many since that have shown persistent elevation of inflammation even after the maltreatment is over, if it was significant maltreatment. This is not like a bad day. This is kind of chronic maltreatment. And individuals who were maltreated as a child and had depression at age 32, almost 40% had elevated C-reactive proteins. This is one example of a growing body of scientific evidence to suggest that children who experience significant maltreatment early in their lives, whether they consciously remember it or not, the body remembers. There are biological memories that show traces into early adult life at age 32 that are indicating a higher risk for heart disease. And this is kind of beginning to explain how this happens, because we know from the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that many of you are aware of that generates these so-called ACEs scores, that individuals with heart disease had a much higher risk of having had serious adversity decades earlier when they were children. So I summarized all of the information in the last couple of slides by saying that we have an overwhelming body of science now that continues to get stronger and stronger every year that is telling us without any question that early experiences are literally built into our bodies, for better or for worse. And when children have positive early experiences in safe, nurturing, enriching, protective environments, they develop healthy brain circuits, they develop healthy cardiovascular system, healthy immune system, and have a good foundation, not a guarantee, but a good foundation for effective learning and lifelong health. But the flip side of that is that research on the biology of stress shows us how increases in heart rate and blood pressure and stress hormones and blood sugar and in the inflammatory response, which are all very important for dealing with acute threat, become a real problem if that activation is excessive or prolonged. In the absence of adults who are helping to buffer the child from that stress, in the absence of adult role modeling and scaffolding to help children build their own capacity to cope with stress. The stress is a normal part of life. The ideal is not to avoid stress, it's to build the capacity to deal with it, which leads to more resilience in the face of adversity. When those supports are not there and the stress response system remains highly activated, that can lead to long-term disruptions in brain architecture that affect learning, immune status that affects your vulnerability to infection and, in some cases, some forms of cancer, metabolic systems that could lead to greater risk for diabetes, and cardiovascular function that could lead to later risk of heart attacks, all of which are more prevalent among low-income populations and particularly low-income populations of color. So we're beginning to get inside and understand how these kind of social class differences and differences related to minority status are associated with adversity early in life. So what I want to do now is shift to the second part of my presentation, which is talk a little bit about kind of how we can begin to use this science to think about how to develop more effective investments, more effective policies and programs, particularly in the early years for children experiencing adversity. So this first slide, next slide, shows what our current conceptual framework is for most of the policies and practices that we have right now in the early childhood arena. What the slide is showing is that some combination of parenting education, sound nutrition, stimulating experiences, often certainly in the home, but supplemented in early childhood childcare centers and education centers when needed, primary medical care, and a health-promoting environment, all of these elements together kind of leads to positive developmental trajectories and a readiness to succeed in school. That's pretty much where our policies are right now. And the science behind this model, which we've known for decades, is still pretty sound. So in most cases, this works, and most children get enough of these foundational requirements, and most children come to school ready to learn and ready to succeed. However, there's a part of the population for which there's a significant burden of adversity related to various combinations of deep poverty, food insecurity, exposure to violence, parental substance abuse, maternal depression, violence in the home, violence in the community, all of which activate the stress system and can produce the kinds of effects that we talked about before. Our thinking is that when that level of adversity becomes beyond a certain level, it pushes down to the extent that these other foundational factors get overwhelmed by the adversity, and we end up with impaired development in children, inadequate preparation to succeed in school, greater likelihood to develop health problems, and greater likelihood to have problems regulating behavior and engaging in good pro-social interactions. So with this as our kind of conceptual understanding of what the current programs look like and the current practices look like, we go back to the science that I talked about early in this presentation and ask, how could that science give us some ideas about what we might do differently to increase the return on investment in our early childhood policies and programs and move toward breakthrough impacts that would more significantly reduce some of these gaps in achievement in school as well as health. So the first kind of observation that we made is that although early childhood policy practice right now is largely viewed through an education lens and is largely looked at as enhancing children's readiness to succeed in school, but the science says that early experiences affect lifelong health as much as they affect later learning, and that we need to start to think about early childhood through a health lens as much as through an education lens. This is kind of really getting at the heart of health promotion and health promotion and disease prevention, and not think that the answer is to get 30 and 40-year-olds to stop smoking and start exercising and eating better. The second paradigm shift here is also to note that based on some of the things I mentioned before, that healthy development requires more than just enrichment for children and information for parents. That for the most disadvantaged children, we need to balance our enrichment approach with some focus on providing protection against excessive stress activation, protection for the developing brain and other immature organs against the consequences of toxic stress. So with these two kind of framing shifts in our mind, we've then begun to develop some hypotheses about what some new interventions might look like and some new policy directions might look like. So what I'm going to show you now in the next couple of slides is really at the cutting edge of what we're thinking about right now, what we're beginning to co-design with people on the ground and test, and in the true spirit of the way innovation works. The first couple of things we try are not going to be the breakthrough answers, but if we keep trying some new things, we will eventually learn from the things that don't work and take things to another level, and that's what innovation is all about. It's not just improving the quality of what we're doing now, but it's thinking about how we can learn new things that can produce breakthrough outcomes. So our first hypothesis is that if young children experiencing adversity need a combination of protection and enrichment, not just enrichment, that's going to require more than just giving parents information and advice. It's going to require building their capacity and their skills to buffer their children against the consequences of toxic stress. What those capacities are, I'll get to in a moment, but hold this in your mind now. Our first hypothesis is that we have to move from information giving and advice to skill building for parents. And as we started to think about the importance of skill building in parents for parenting, it became very clear to people we were working with that these same skills that are needed to be able to create a well-regulated home environment that promotes healthy development are very much overlapping with a lot of the skills that you need to be employable and to be more economically secure and stable. The ability to focus your attention and plan and monitor and solve problems and those kinds of things that are important for parenting and for employability. And the third area that, and by the way, obviously, anything that leads to employability and better jobs with better income then reduces a significant source of stress for family life, which is obviously going to be to the benefit of the child. And the third domain gets to the issue of a community-based approach, not just a family-based approach, but a community-based approach. And we know in many places around the country, I'm sure in all of your states and communities, there are kind of community-focused efforts to enhance life for families with young children. We look to the science, and the science tells us that within a broad community-based approach, we need to be more targeted, to focus on those particular precipitants of toxic stress that exist in a community that differs from community to community. But for example, if violence is a problem in a community, if substance abuse is a problem in the community, if mental health is a problem in the community, this is more than just a family-by-family issue. This is a matter of a community-based approach to providing the supports and the protections that families need in order to be able to provide the support and protection and enrichment for their children. So what are these skills that I'm talking about? I began to highlight some of the dimensions a few minutes ago. The skills, as we started to ask the question to ourselves, is before we talk specifically about parenting and economic self-sufficiency, what are the core foundational skills for being a successful adult that are necessary for all of these things? The core skills that are necessary to be a good parent, be an effective worker, be able to move up the income ladder by increasingly more demanding jobs, by being able, what are the skills required to be and the capabilities required to be a responsible citizen in the community and to be a kind of a lawful contributor to the community. And this led us more and more to what in the world of developmental science are referred to as executive function and self-regulation skills. These are core dimensions of adult competence that include the ability to focus and sustain your attention, set goals and make plans, follow rules, solve problems, monitor actions, defer gratification, control impulses. You can see in this picture of the brain, it shows you that we actually have been learning, and we can identify where in the brain a lot of the circuitry is for a lot of these skills. We also know that many of these areas of the brain are particularly sensitive to disruption from elevated stress hormones that stay high for long periods of time. So we're getting smarter and smarter and have a better understanding of what these skills are and how to build them. And these skills, the foundations for these skills, begin early in childhood. In fact, social class differences in parts of the brain depicted on this picture in this slide, social class differences begin to appear as early as infancy in some cases. This is an area that we've paid less attention to. We've been focusing mostly on early reading, early language development, and all of which is very important. This is not more important than reading to children and talking to them, but it clearly is something that also needs more attention. Now, here's the challenge from a science point of view. The challenge is, this is a discouraging slide if you look at it and think about what it means, but it's the harsh reality, is that this red line reflects what scientists call the plasticity of the brain. We might describe that as the brain's flexibility, its adaptability, and the sad truth is that the older we get, the less flexible and plastic our brains are. Our brains are maximally flexible and plastic in early childhood, and you can see that flexibility drops dramatically in the early childhood years and leading up to school. It then continues to decrease, but not as rapidly, over the course of middle childhood into early adult life and extending all the way through. This slide goes to age 70. You can see how much less flexible the brain of a 70-year-old is compared to the brain of a 10-year-old. But the good news is that red line never goes to zero, so it's never too late to learn new things, but it's harder. And it's particularly harder to change behaviors and to unlearn skills that have been learned in the wrong way. And you can see also the complementary blue line shows that as the brain matures, and actually as it's pruning away circuits that it doesn't need and strengthening circuits that it builds early on, the actual effort required by the brain to make corrections increases. The physiological cost to the brain increases as it tries to adapt, and it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see that the financial cost to society increases. So the later we wait, the more expensive it gets. Prevention is always better than treatment. Early is always better than later. It's never too late to make changes, but you pay more and you get less. So later you jump in. So that's the challenge as we talk about building adult skills to improve children's outcomes. Adults have less flexible brains than children, so we should have gotten it right the first time, but when we didn't, here's the opportunity. So what science tells us is this curve is the curve of the development of these executive function skills in the prefrontal cortex, the front part of the brain. And what it shows is in this first yellow bar between the ages of 3 to 5 years, this is the most rapid period of development of these executive function skills. It's a very steep slope. And this is a wonderful example of where science coincides with common sense and experience. If you ask most people what's the difference between a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, among other things, you'll get answers like a 5-year-old can pay attention better than a 3-year-old for a longer period of time. A 5-year-old can play Simon Says, and a 3-year-old can't, because a 5-year-old can kind of remember the rules and remember that you do things when Simon says and you don't do it if Simon doesn't say. A 5-year-old can have a better chance to pay attention, follow directions, keep your hands to yourself, control your impulses. This has nothing to do with necessarily only motivation or behavior. This has to do with the development of these skills. So the period from age 3 to 5 is hugely important, the development of these skills. And when children are growing up in a very disorganized environment, without a lot of good supports for kind of regularized, predictable behavior, they develop poor circuitry in this area and poor skills in this area. But here's the good news. This is the opportunity. If you look at the second yellow band, although these skills are continuing to increase from age 5 to age 10 to 15, but not as high a rate, there's another acceleration of the rate of development of these higher level executive function skills between age 15 and 25 years, which captures a good part of the adult population in the early childbearing years. So the message from this slide is, it would have been good to get it right the first time, but if you didn't and you have to do some remediation later, there's a period between age 15 and 25 where the part of the brain responsible for these skills is more plastic, more adaptable, and we could capitalize on this. It's like Mother Nature gave us another shot at it. And this is where, when we look at the science and we look at current policies, we say, with all of this adaptability in up to age 25 and maybe close to 30, maybe we should be doing more than just giving parents information and advice. This is a window of opportunity for active skill building at a time when these higher level skills are actually being solidified in the brain. So, interestingly enough, this concept, let me go back before I give away the punchline. This concept of skill building is going to produce better outcomes and have a bigger influence on children than just giving information. We came to that as a hypothesis based on just kind of thinking about how to use these scientific principles to stimulate some new ideas. We then more recently had access to a database that we've been building that has coded data from every study that's been done for the last 47 years on evaluating programs from the prenatal period up to age 5. And one of the things we looked at in thousands and thousands of studies, a large percentage of which were poor quality studies that didn't meet reasonable standards for science. So when you boil it down, it's really, maybe 100 studies or somewhere between 100 and 150 studies. And then even to be more refined, it's under 100, but still a decent number of studies of center-based early childhood education programs. We asked the question and used this database to say, what's the difference in impact on children between programs that provided no parent involvement and just provided an early education program for children? What happens if you add a parent education program that provides information to parents and advice? And then what happens if you provide a parent involvement that includes coaching and role modeling and more active engagement in skill building rather than just giving parents information? So here's my blockbuster video. This is my blockbuster slide, and this is in the process of being reviewed. It's been presented at scientific meetings, but the paper is being reviewed right now and is not yet in publication. So let me walk you through this slide. It has very important information. This is averaging the impacts of early childhood education programs over about 88 studies from 1960 to 2007. And the blue bars represent the effect size, which is the magnitude of impact on a standardized test of cognition and on pre-academic skills, basically in reading, early reading skills and early math skills at school entry. And what this shows is that on average, these programs had a positive effect, a little bit larger effect on cognitive skills than on pre-academic skills, but clearly a positive effect. For programs where there was no parent component, and if you added parent education without modeling, it didn't change the impact on the kids' scores at all. You got the same effect. No additional benefits from adding parenting education. But if you added active parent skill building with modeling and practice, you got a significant increase in cognitive performance in the children, and you more than doubled the child's performance on pre-reading and pre-math skills at school entry. I want to really reinforce that and have you look at this slide. Adding an active parent skill building component moved the effect size from somewhere between 0.1 and 0.2 to almost 0.4, a major increase in the impact by going from no parent involvement or just giving information to active skill building. If this isn't a call for moving beyond just giving out information to parents and working on skill building, then I don't know what is. And what this is reflecting is that we are in this window of opportunity where skill building is possible, and we need to seriously think for the most disadvantaged kids about why we're not getting bigger impacts from just having parenting classes, which are not really shown to be that effective. So here's my summary message. I'm going to close up now, and we'll move to Representative Crouch for comments and then the Q&A. Albert Einstein nailed the problem. We have good quality. We have a good quality model of early childhood intervention that had its origins back in the war on poverty in the 1960s with the initial development of Head Start. Over the years, we've had some refinements of that basic model of information and enrichment for parents, enriched learning opportunities for kids and center-based programming, family supports, good nutrition, and we get, when we do it well, we get a mild to moderate increase in children's performance. The goal here is to really push that ceiling up and get a much bigger increase in children's performance. Our position is that that's going to come from new ideas, not just from quality improvement. We've got a lot of science to guide the thinking of new ideas. If we don't try new things and we continue to do just what we know how to do, we will get mild to moderate impacts, and they're real, and they translate into a return on investment, but it's small relative to the returns we could be getting by more effective programs. Einstein said it pretty bluntly. If you always do what you always did, you will always get what you always got. We feel that the time has come for us to start, not to take the best of what we have right now as a starting point. It's a very good foundation. There's nothing about the best of what we do right now that isn't a good start, and it does return a positive financial increment to society, but we could and we must do better. So here's our website for those of you who don't have it. If you want more information on a lot of this science, it's up there. We would invite you to log on. I will stop right here and pass the torch and look forward to Representative Crouch's comments and then an open discussion. So thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Jack. This was a really informative. Is that echoing? Sorry, I thought I heard an echo. Thanks so much, Jack, for this informative and interesting presentation. I thought it was really great. I hope everybody who's listening in today enjoyed that. Representative Crouch, we're excited to hear from you now.
Oh, well, thank you. First of all, Doctor, I appreciate your presentation. I've learned a lot from it. And let me share with you.
Please call me Jack. Please call me
Jack. All right. Well, you can call me Suzanne. But anyway, I appreciate your presentation, not only in Atlanta, but then again today, because I'm pretty new to this issue. My community, there is a coalition of business people and community leaders that have taken this issue on here in Indiana, in my hometown, and approached me as a legislator asking me to get involved legislatively to move something forward at the state level, because Indiana was one of either 8 or 9 states that had not actually gotten involved in early childhood education. In fact, it's just within the last budget that we fully funded all-day kindergarten here in our state. So not knowing that much about the issue, while we had some success in getting some legislation passed, what I actually, the challenges that I faced as a legislator who really wasn't too well versed on this issue is I wasn't familiar with the science, and that's what has been so helpful to me in your presentations is the actual science, not just talking in theory, but actually having the documentation to support that. That is extremely helpful. And then the other part is that parental component, because Indiana is extremely conservative, and the pushback that I got from a lot of legislators was, well, the state doesn't need to be involved in that. We don't need to be spending money in that. It's the parents' responsibility. They're the ones that should be taking care of this. And so I have found your discussion on the whole parental component to be extremely helpful. And so from my standpoint as a legislator, to go back and to continue to build on the very small success we had this session, I need to, number one, be able to educate legislators on the science, and then be able to convince them that there needs to be a parental component, and we're talking about children who perhaps do not have the parents that either can or are engaged in giving them that kind of support that they need. So it has been extremely helpful for me. I'm sure that different people take away different things based upon their level of expertise in this area. But for me, your sessions have been, your presentations have been extremely helpful, and I hope to build upon that knowledge that you've given me so that I can go back and we can be more successful in terms of building upon the little bit that we did this year. So I thank you for that. And I do have with me Jennifer Drake, and she is extremely involved in early childhood education. And at the appropriate time, she would like to also ask a question. And thank you, Jack.
Well, I thank you, Suzanne, for those kind comments. And let me just say one thing in response to a very important thing you said, which is that we hear this a lot, and I have a lot of respect for people who say that raising children is the family's responsibility, not the government's responsibility. There's nothing about the science or anything I said that would remotely indicate that the government could do a better job than parents to raise kids. I don't think any of us remotely would say it's the government's job. I think the question here is what do we do for those families who need extra help or support to be able to do the job effectively that we all want them to do. And this is where government will not raise children, but government could really provide the right kinds of supports and scaffolds for families to be able to take on that responsibility. And the reason that some families and communities can't do that effectively is because when they were little children, their communities and families were not able to provide what they needed. So these children who we see in front of us right now, who are going to have to be sharing the burden of paying off all this debt, right, and paying for all the Social Security and Medicare, they're not going to be any better prepared either to do this, not to mention be employable in the global economy, unless we provide the supports for them now. So this is not taking over the parent's role, it's strengthening the family's role.
Thank you.
And at this time, the floor is now open for questions. You can submit your question via chat by submitting your question in the chat box on the lower right-hand side of your screen, or you can press *1 on your telephone keypad at this time. Questions will be taken in the order that they are received. If you're using a speakerphone, we ask that while posing your question, you pick up your handset to provide favorable sound quality. If at any time your question has been answered, you can remove yourself from the queue by pressing 1. Again, ladies and gentlemen, please submit your question via chat or press *1 on your telephone keypad at this time. Please hold while we poll for questions.
So this is Julie Poppy, and I'm going to man the chat box here to see if we've received any questions, which we have. And the first one to Dr. Shonkoff is from Senator Julie Lassa from Wisconsin, and she asks where she saw an article recently about how toxic stress can be so powerful and it can rewrite a person's genetic code. Is this what you were referring to in your presentation as biological memories?
Yeah, this is a great question, and thank you. So the article is essentially saying something that is correct, but let me refine this a little bit. So the genetic code, which is the DNA sequencing you have at birth, never changes. And there's nothing about toxic stress or the environment that can change the genetic code. But what is important is how the genetic code gets expressed. So all of us have each of us has a unique set of genes, and every cell in our body has the same genes. And some of those cells are in the brain, and some are in the stomach, and some are in the foot. And each of those cells has the same genes. So obviously the genes work differently in different places. And so what you read about and what this was referring to was this whole new exciting area called epigenetics, which is showing that in experiences, whether it be highly stressful experiences, or this is also how environmental toxins can have their impact. They get into the body, at the molecular level, can actually change the structure around the genes that decides whether a gene gets turned on or turned off. So in that sense, it is a biological memory. You'll probably now start seeing the word epigenetics, because genetic code is half of the story, and the other story is environmental influences. And together, they result in whatever it is we're looking at. The cancer story is a good one as an example. We all know there are cancers that run in families, but not everybody in the family gets it. There are cancers that are high rates in certain communities where there's something in the environment causing cancer, but not everybody there who lives there gets it. So everything is about an interaction between genetics and experience or environment. It's not one or the other. And what that article was referring to is how toxic stress cannot rewrite a genetic code, but it can change the structure around the genes that can either turn the gene off or turn the gene on. And that literally is part of what we mean by these biological memories, because some of these switches that can get turned off early on then are very difficult to turn back on later. It's a great question. This is the molecular biology of the interaction between your genetics and your environment, and we're beginning to study it and understand it at that level.
Oh, thanks, Jack. I'm going to take another chat box question here. This is about how we're framing the issue. So early childhood care and education has been framed as an education issue and a health issue. Could you address it possibly as a workforce issue?
Yeah, absolutely, and I would think it could be addressed as a workforce issue on two levels. One, and this is real, I mean, I know everybody's heard this in one form or the other. After a while, your eyes glaze over and you feel like, oh my God, I've heard that 1,000 times before. But this is about the future of the workforce of our country, because this is laying either a strong or a weak foundation for effective learning and effective behavior that is necessary to succeed in school, which is then necessary to succeed in the workplace and to move up the employment ladder and get a high-paying job. So this is the foundation of our country's workforce, no question about it. This should be a part of the human capital workforce development agenda. Certainly Jim Heckman has been very persuasive and outspoken on this issue. But there's also another workforce dimension to early childhood, which is the early childhood workforce, people who work in early care and education programs specifically. And we do know we've had a long-standing problem in our country about the very variable quality of child care, ranging from outstanding high-quality care with very well-trained and skilled people to abysmally poor care that could be, frankly, dangerous to children, and a large hunk of mediocre care that just is, maybe it's not life-threatening, but it's not providing what children need. And the fact is that mixed in with a lot of very skilled professionals, and it's not that you have to be a professional to be a good child care provider, but a large percentage of child care providers are women with limited education and limited income who have a lot of the same skill-building needs that many parents with limited education and limited income need. So when we talk about building adult capacities, we're not just talking about building these skills in parents. We're talking about this as a professional development and workforce development issue for the early childhood workforce. So it's a very important question, and I thank you for it. And then the other thing, all of this stuff costs money, and we all know that the public sector doesn't have a lot of money. But part of, I think, the value of the last question and what I said before is that early childhood can't all be on the backs of the education committees and the Department of Education. The health committees and the economic development committees have an equal stake in the ground on this. The science could not be more clear, and I think that's be a much more effective way for us to start thinking about this. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for your response. That was great. I'm going to go ahead and see if there are any questions on the phone.
Yeah. We do have a question from Roy Takumi. Please state your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jack. Very insightful, very helpful. But what I'm thinking of, are you advocating that states that either have obviously robust early childhood education programs, or like Hawaii, and we're on the cusp of starting one, that we require child care providers, whether it's site-based or family-child interaction programs, that they build in an active parental component to their program. Because as we know, many site-based facilities basically focus in on the child, where the parent drops off that child and then picks them up. And what I'm gathering from you is that, well, that's okay. It's not ideal. So if we were to build that in, now we all know the more we build in, the more it costs. The more it costs, the fewer seats that we can offer to the community. So I just wanted to get your thinking on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you. And let me first be clear. I'm not advocating anything. Advocacy is not part of what we do because it very quickly gets into, kind of one way of spending money versus another. So we leave that to people who, work on the lobbying end. We try to stay away from that. So what I'm simply doing is trying the best we can to help folks, like this group, be aware of what the science says and begin to think about the implications, and then you decide what to do with it, because in the end, that's your decision. But here's how I'd answer your question. We know, without any question, that the quality of childcare has an influence on children's learning and their developmental outcomes, from the highest quality to the poorest quality. But on top of that, one thing that has been demonstrated over and over and over again every time we've studied it is that although child care quality has an impact on outcomes, family influences are always more important and account for a bigger part of the outcome than the child care or the early education or anything else. So the family variables are always the biggest predictor of outcomes. Now, you're absolutely right. A parent component that's working on skill building takes the price of child care and ratchets it way up. So I think this is where just practical decisions have to be made, both in terms of where priorities are and how do we differentiate different needs within the population. So most children, even children living in poor families, live in homes that provide a decent environment for kids to grow up in. So that would say for most kids in child care, you don't need to build in a parent component. But for that part of the population where the families are really struggling and are not able to provide a reasonably well-regulated home environment for the children, the program evaluation couldn't be more clear. Good quality child care will clearly help. The children will do better. But if we don't do anything to strengthen the family resources, we're not going to get as good an outcome. So it's a relatively small part of the population in child care that needs that extra skill building. No question it adds to the cost, but also we're now talking about that relatively small group that will be the most expensive group later, because this is the group most at risk for not completing enough education, not being economically self-sufficient, and of course the big budget buster, which is ending up in prison. So I think this is where choices have to be made. We don't make recommendations, we share the science, but clearly there's nothing about the science that says every child care center needs a parent skill building program. But certainly programs that serve vulnerable populations have a subgroup whose children will not do as well unless we do something to strengthen the family from the very beginning.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Top of the hour. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to let you know there appear to be no live questions at this time.
Okay, it's top of the hour, and we're going to just have Jack for just a few more minutes. So I have one last question in the chat box, and we'll answer this question, and then we'll end the call. So I have a question here about vocabulary. Vocabulary is often used as an indicator for academic readiness and or achievement. We're considering using some type of vocabulary assessment to track the impact of our efforts. How do you make the case for focusing on vocabulary among all the potential aspects of development?
So let me be quick on this, so maybe we can squeeze in another question. The reason vocabulary is an important thing to measure is it's a very strong vocabulary in the preschool years is a strong predictor of third grade reading scores, which is a strong predictor of high school graduation. That's why vocabulary is important, no question about it. But if vocabulary were the only thing we were tracking, we would be really moving in a bad direction, because there are other aspects of development, particularly related to social skills and emotional well-being, and other aspects of development that are also very important. And so this is not a kind of a silver bullet approach. Vocabulary is important, but it shouldn't be the only thing focused on. But if you're interested in third grade reading scores, it's a good one to focus on.
Yeah.
But if you
Okay,
have
Jack,
good vocabulary and you can't keep your hands to yourself and you can't sit still, you're not going to do well.
Okay, Jack, we have one last question for you, and then we'll let you go and finish up the call, the webinar call. How do we best reach parents to build skills with home visiting programs? Also, Wisconsin is looking to make significant workforce program changes, and how can we look at training of our workforce? Can you recommend any additional resources I can bring to the Council on Workforce Investment that I sit on in Wisconsin?
Yeah, so let me see what I can say in 30 seconds or less. So there isn't going to be one answer for every state. I think it starts with kind of where the capacities and the resources and the skills are in the state. It starts with an understanding of what the important goals are of this skill building, whether it be kind of parenting education or workforce development education. There are cultural differences that really matter here. For some families, a home-based skill building assistance would be very well accepted. For others, it would be culturally inappropriate and needs to be in another center. And when we talk about skill building, we have to take into account cultural differences because there's a danger of being perceived as coming in from the outside and telling parents how they should raise their kids and what to do. So this is where the science has to, we use the science as a framework for thinking about what's important. And then the ownership of this cannot be just in the hands of scientists or researchers. It has to be owned by families. It has to be owned by policy makers. It has to be owned by service providers. And working together, people kind of come to an agreement about what fits, what works, what's affordable, what kind of makes sense in our community. And I think the role of science here is then to put some large parameters out at the beginning, let people take that and decide how to make sense of it and translate that into an action agenda, and then ask the science community whether this is scientifically sound, and then move forward, but not expect that researchers are going to tell parents and service providers how to do this. It has to fit, it has to be owned within each community by the people who live and work there.
Thanks, Jack. So we have a few other questions still, but I know that we need to finish the call. So what we're going to do is take these questions and we will get back to the fellows with some answers through email or through our listserv. So I'm going to hand the call back over to Robin to wrap it up.
Okay. Jack, thank you so much again for this great presentation, and thanks Representative Crouch. And thanks to all of you who've been on the line listening today. We're really sorry about the technical difficulties we had at the beginning, and glad that all of you were able to get on to hear this. An archived copy of the webinar will be available shortly, and we'll email a URL as soon as that is available. And also, you may know from the last webinar we did, evaluation was sent out. So your feedback really helps us in creating a more meaningful and beneficial program for you all. An online evaluation survey is going to be mailed out to you shortly, so please take a few moments to complete the evaluation. We do take your feedback seriously, and we do want to hear from you. Again, we'll convene again this year's Fellows Program in Washington, December 6th and 7th. This will be our final in-person meeting for the 2013 class of Fellows. More information will be coming soon. And finally, please remember, NCSL, we're here for you. If you have any questions or comments or feedback, please feel free to email any staff member on the Early Care and Education Project team. We also invite you to email relevant information to your fellow colleagues by using the email distribution list that you see on the screen. So again, thank you everyone, and have a great day.